This last love story is a true story from the Chestnut Hill neighborhood I grew up in. It was a very stable neighborhood for the most part. People that lived there had lived there for decades. In the 40s and 50s, there was no real estate industry in Salisbury. Houses stayed in families. People didn't move. They did not move. Mary Ann, my best friend that lived across the street, she lived there with her mother and her grandmother and her brother and father. There were 3 generations in that house. Mary Ann's mother never lived in another house. She lived in that house. She was born in that house, and she lived in that house to the very, very near the end of her life. So that was common. It was a very stable neighborhood. And that stable neighborhood has led to some stable friendships. My best friend Dolores of 70-some years is here, as is Mary Ann. So it was a wonderful way to grow up. There was one source of instability in that neighborhood, though. And we had one rental house on the block, our block. And the people in the neighborhood didn't like having that rental house there because it was always people moving in and out. We couldn't seem to get anybody to stay a long time. They were always poor, and which wasn't bad, we were all poor. But they always had a lot of children, and their children ran all over the neighborhood and kind of ran wild. And they didn't keep up the place, so it was an eyesore. But when I was 12 years old and somewhere like that, Novella Flo and her 4 children moved into that house. Novella, it had been vacant for a while, but she moved into that house with her 4 children. She was a very young woman, probably 23 or 24 years old, and very pretty. She was a very pretty woman. She had a beautiful complexion. She was very slender. She wore her hair longer and kind of loosely curled like movie stars in the 40s did. And I knew that there was an interesting story here because the women in the neighborhood after she moved in, started talking and whispering and talking in code and things. And because, it was unusual. There was no husband. Her husband wasn't with her. But I kept hearing, I couldn't get anything. I could hear the word jail. I could hear the word gun. I could hear things like that. So I didn't know what happened, but I heard the word Texas. So I got the idea they had lived in Texas. Something bad had happened. And with her husband, I didn't know if he was in jail or what had happened, but she had moved to North Carolina. She had family in this block down below who had helped her find this rental house and get set up there. Her children ranged in age at that point from about 3 to about 8. Now, the women in our neighborhood, the older women especially, most of them didn't work, and they judged harshly. They were, and they were watching Novella to see whether Novella would be a good woman or a bad woman. And so they knew she'd be, signs of a bad woman were if she didn't keep a tidy house. That was number 1. She had to keep a clean house. Number 2, her children had to be in clean clothes, be clean, be well-mannered, and not run around wild all over the neighborhood. 3, if she was a good woman, she wouldn't be having any male visitors. And no alcohol, no beer cans in the yard, no thrown-out bourbon bottles, nothing like that. All those were signs that, so they were watching, and they weren't going to accept Novella until they knew whether she was a good woman or she was a bad woman. But it didn't take very long for them to realize that she was a good woman. First, she kept an immaculate house. It was always clean, porch was always clean, nothing was lying around. Her children were always in clean clothes, well-mannered to the adults, pleasant children. And this house was a really old house. It was about 50 years old. It had never been painted. And so it was brown burnished wood like you see on barns and sheds out in the country sometime. And it had a yard to match. It had a brown dirt yard. There wasn't a shrub. There wasn't any flowers. There was not a single blade of grass on that yard. It was a brown house with a brown dirt yard. But every dry day that we had, Novella Flo was out in her yard sweeping her yard. And not only did she never have any male visitors, she didn't flirt with their husbands either. So that was good. And no alcohol. There was never any alcohol. So they decided Novella was a good woman, and they accepted her. So as a sign of their acceptance and respect for her, they took her, a pound cake and some food and gifts for the children. And thereafter, she was a member of our neighborhood and included in all those things like showers that you give for people who are going to get married and have babies and teas and things. And she was very poor. Novella was extremely poor. She did not work and had 4 children. So whenever they could, they helped her out by, if somebody needed somebody to help with spring cleaning, they would hire Novella. If they needed, somebody was sick and they needed a little extra help, they would hire her. They looked for opportunities that they could give her a chance to make some money and not have to leave her home. Well, across the street from Novella Flo lived Miss Bertha, who was the oldest woman in the neighborhood. She was so old, her hair was so white it looked bleached, and she'd gotten very frail, very seldom came out of the house now. And her son Bobby lived there with her. Bobby was already in his mid-40s, and he was really a loner. He didn't have any friends, didn't have any male friends that he went bowling with, didn't have any girlfriends, never dated. His life was working at the lumber yard where he worked, coming home, eating a quick dinner, going out to his large workshop in his backyard where he did woodworking and made furniture. And he made beautiful furniture. People bought it and prized it. It was prized because it was beautiful wood and he did such great work. So that was Bobby's life, the lumber yard, his mother, making furniture. And he was not very friendly at all to us kids. A lot of people would joke with us, say hey to us. He'd just drive on by, wouldn't say anything, just go into the house. And he had begun to get a little, look a little middle-aged looking, a little paunchy, he's getting a little bald-headed. And everybody, talked about Bobby as like he was a eunuch or something maybe. And he had no interest in women, so they thought he's a confirmed bachelor. A mama's boy is what they told him. Well, Miss Bertha had a really bad stroke. And back then, we didn't have rehab centers or anything like that. So after she got out of the hospital, she had to come home. But she couldn't resume her normal things that she did around the house. So Bobby asked Novella if he could hire her to watch Miss Bertha during the day, cook dinner for him at night, and then help get Miss Bertha in bed. Well, that was perfect for her. She could go back and forth between her house and his house, and she could, be there when her kids came home from school and all that kind of thing. I was already a junior in high school when this happened, and the kids were growing up too. So the older kids were now about to be in high school. So they didn't need quite as much care as they did before. So it worked out perfectly for her. And Bobby, they developed a routine. And we did notice though that Bobby must have liked her cooking, because when he came home, he would just bound up those steps, eager to get there. When we were young, we would play outside at night, and we played a game called Ain't No Bears Out Tonight, which was a kind of hide-and-go-seek game. And Marianne and my brother and I would play with other kids. And it was like we had one big backyard, because all the backyards just flowed one backyard to the other. There were no fences, no hedges. People didn't care if we played in their backyard. So we'd play in our backyard, Butcher's backyard, other people's backyards. The only backyard we couldn't play in was Bobby's, because they didn't want us, said, don't go near his workshop. He doesn't want any children around there. You could get hurt. Miss Butcher said you could cut your arm off. So we always had to stop short. But one night we were out there, and he was in his workshop. It was summer. It was just beginning to get dark. And we could see him bent over his work table. We could hear the radio coming out, and he was making something. So we were all curious, what could he be making? And we were debating the issue. My brother said, I bet he's making a hobby horse, a rocking horse, something I can play with. I said, no, I bet he's making a roller coaster for the city park. Big projects were in my mind. Marianne, my friend, the most practical of all three of us, said, I bet he's making a casket for Miss Bertha. Well, at that point, we had to find out what Bobby was making. So we walked and got to the edge of the building and knelt down and crept along that building till we got to the window ledge. And just as we got to Bobby's window, we were going to started to stand up and peep in that window, and just then he looked up and saw us. And he came running out, hollering and screaming at us and saying ugly things to us, and we went running. And after that, we never spoke to him, didn't want to have anything to do with Bobby. I even asked my mother if something was wrong with him because of the way he acted. She said, no, he's just shy. He doesn't know how to act around people. But he's got a good heart, and he's taking care of his mother. Not many men would do that. So she continued to take care of Miss Bertha, and the house looked better, everything was better. I even noticed that he took her children into his workshop and showed them what he was doing. I thought, that's really weird. And one night I was out there when they all got in his car, and they said they were going to the drive-in. I said, Mama, Bobby's taking them to the drive-in. Oh, isn't that nice? That's wonderful. So after Miss Bertha died, Novella continued to keep house for Bobby and do things, because he did need the help and all. And the women didn't think anything of it. There was nothing amiss. Bobby was a confirmed bachelor, no interest in women. And they knew that Novella went to her home every night. But a few months after Miss Bertha died, they announced to the neighborhood that they were getting married. And they were very happy, and they said that they weren't going to move right away or get married right away, that Bobby wanted to build a house for them. And he'd bought some land just outside of town in the county, and he built them a house, and he even built most of the furniture for the house. And when the house was ready and everything, they got married in June of 1961 at Haven Lutheran Church, just a couple of blocks down from us. And it was the year we graduated high school. And after the wedding, they all moved out to their new house, the house that Bobby built. And I never saw them again. I had graduated high school, I went on to college, and we just didn't run into each other. Mama saw them around town occasionally. Bobby still worked at the lumber yard. And she would tell me that she'd run into them and things. One night, the Rowan County Fair was going on, and I'd already graduated college by now, and I was living in New York at the time, and Mama called me to tell me that she had been to the Rowan County Fair and had run into Bobby and Novella. And after they married, their marriage flourished. Within a year, she had one child, and shortly thereafter, she had a second child. So they were there at the fair with their two younger children. The others were older. And Mama said she had never seen a happier couple, that they stopped and talked a while. They told her about their happiness, their house, their children, and they just talked. And Mama said the last she saw of them, Bobby had the youngest on his shoulders, and she was holding the hand of the other one, and they were heading off into the looking at the fireworks display for the night. And that was their love story. So, now to wrap this all up, I guess, the thing to observe here is that you never know when or where love is going on. I mean, it can be anywhere. It could be in a garage, in the back of a garage. You might have to sleuth out these love stories, and it might take a while. You might have to have some patience. It might take your whole life. Took a long time for me to figure out Miss Butcher's love story. But I guarantee you there are stories out there waiting to be sleuthed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.